Mohammad Salemy is an artist, curator whose academic focus is art history. That led him to the American Museum of Natural History in New York, where he explored the archives of artist and big game hunter James L. Clark. The result is an exhibition called Nature, Knowledge, and the Knower. It is my pleasure to welcome Mohammad Salemy to Studio 4 to tell us more.
Hello.
Hello. What led you on this search to the archives?
Well, it all began in 2003. I had a friend who used to work there, and I would go to New York, and I would always skip the Museum of Natural History because you want to go to see the MoMA or the other more contemporary exhibitions.
Sure.
And he was like, you've never been to the Museum of Natural History? You have to see the Akeley's African Hall. So he dragged me there, and then just walking in to the hall for the first time, I had a sense of having walked into like a virtual reality world. And I was amazed when I found out that these displays were put together between 1926 and 1937. And I started thinking of what type of technologies, what kind of approaches they had to take in order to create this. So that kind of like I made a footnote in the back of my mind. And then first time I could professionally research it, I was like, I really want to go back there and dig. So I wrote letters and arranged to work there last summer of 2010. And when I arrived there, they basically had just received Clark files in boxes, and they were looking for someone who would just like look at them and see if they're worth keeping or checking out and throwing away, because the exhibition department had decided they don't need them anymore.
Right, every museum deals with that space.
Yes, and kind of like what needs to become part of the memory of the museum in the archive and what needs to be thrown out.
Who was James L. Clark?
Well, he was, you know, like the museum's mythology of habitat dioramas is all around this figure of Carl Akeley, who was the fellow who imagined them. He was an inventor. He created this new system for taxidermy that created realistic three-dimensional animals rather than like literally stuffing skins with like stuff. So Akeley trained Clark, and Clark was this young man. And then what happened was Akeley only proposed the hall, and Akeley wanted to do all these dioramas, but then he died in Africa in 1926. And then Clark was the only person who knew the secrets of Akeley's method. Oh. So the museum sort of like replaced Akeley with Clark. And even though most people who go to the museum still think Akeley created all these dioramas, Akeley wasn't even around when the first one was created. So Clark kind of like used Akeley's method, systematized it, and sort of applied it to the African Hall and then the Asian Hall, and then later on he created the American Hall.
Okay.
But he's a kind of an unknown figure even inside the museum. I mean, people in the museum know about him, but he's not held up as the guy. But to me, he's a large part of this model of display.
He was an explorer, a scientist, obviously a big game hunter, an artist, a sculptor, even a Boy Scout.
Yes.
I read that on the Wikipedia or someplace. He was an honorary scout of Boy Scouts of America and president of the Campfire Club.
Yes, CFC. I even visited CFC.
Did you?
Up in Rochester County. Yeah.
So he was a nature lover.
Nature lover.
It appears. The habitat diorama, what is it?
Well,
big, small, large, vast, big room. What is it?
A habitat diorama actually began with the idea of its impossibility. Franz Boas kind of like talks about how it's impossible to show a real chunk of life in the museum because you always are confronted with the columns, with the stairs, with the lighting. So Boas, right when the museum was created, they were thinking of what types of displays the museum need to be putting on, right? And then Boas warned against trying to be realistic because it's impossible.
Right.
So for Boas, the idea was like we should accept that these are fake and work the fakeness into it. Whereas Akeley's idea was totally like, actually, technology is allowing us to create darker spaces. And within this darkness, we can create near real displays.
Okay, so a life-size historical event, essentially, like you have wax figures and real objects and stuffed animals, or
mostly stuffed animals.
Mostly stuffed animals against a painted background.
Against a painted background with lots of accessory in the foreground, and then that old school painting technique of trompe-l'oeil, which in the museum they call it tying in the background with the foreground in a way that you don't notice.
So what's the experience like? You walk in. What do you see?
you situate yourself in front of it, and then you basically see the whole of a scene, and you kind of feel like you're there. It's the closest thing to being there. And we have to look at it in terms of how it fit into other models of display and artistic representation at the time. You have to think of it in terms of how advanced it was compared to black and white cinema, black and white photography, because that's the kind of realistic representation that was there, right? So right now it's easy to kind of like go in and kind of like go like, oh, this is kitsch, and dismiss it. But if you put it in its historical context, you realize that they were an achievement.
Right.
And also there's another element to it, which is if you look at what was happening in the American art scene at the time, this is prior to the arrival of abstract expressionism. This is 1920s. You may even consider it an American art form, but that's something that I need to research and argue further, because what they were doing with technology and installation, it's kind of like installation art for that time. It's just that they never looked at it that way.
It was the virtual reality of its time?
Yes, definitely. That's the argument. And the argument, part of the argument of the show is that by looking at this, we can learn more about our technological ways of knowledge production today, because the way these were put together required a totally different way of collecting visual information and incorporating it into these things. So that's another point of the exhibition.
Sure, if you use your imagination, you feel you are in Africa. You are at a Kenyan waterhole.
Yes.
Perhaps. Let's take a look at the Kenyan waterhole. Tell me about this. Alfred J. Klein, the photo. Over here it should be. There it is.
Yes. Alfred J. Klein was a friend of Clark. Clark told him about Africa. And then he said he was in New York. Actually, he was born in Germany and then raised in New York. And then Clark told him about Africa. And then he went to Africa, fell in love, just stayed in Africa. He only traveled back to New York twice, and the second time to get married, and that's it.
And he's an artist.
He was an artist. He was a big game hunter artist. He worked for the museum as an artist, and then soon he quit and went to Africa and never came back. And basically he had this sort of like contract relationship with the museum, and then he worked for the museum, but he also ran a safari business in Kenya, in Nairobi, where like people will like go to him, and then he will organize their trips and take them around for hunting and all sorts of stuff. But at heart, he was an artist, because you see a lot of drawings by him and paintings by him in my exhibition too. So he had this like multi personality.
Sure.
He is known to have hunted 120 lions.
120
lions. That's
really?
right.
And what about the botanicals in the exhibition? The plant life, the plant specimens?
Yeah, that was a big part of like going on this expedition, because it wasn't just for hunting the animal specimen.
Right.
It was to have a direct experience of these plants, and kind of like, if you can think of, color film wasn't available back then. So to go there and directly experience these colors and make representation that then artists in New York can replicate.
Okay, so did they have cameras? When did
They have black and white cameras, but not
black
color
and white,
cameras.
but not color cameras.
Color
Eastman.
film, Eastman was mostly black and white. See, color film comes in sort of like in the like early 40s, and you see traces of it in the archives, but mostly related to the North American dioramas, which were created like in the early 40s.
So the artist would put the color into the botanicals, or the color into the, well, there wasn't much color in the Kenyan waterhole, but they would add the color. They'd actually paint, draw.
They will paint and they would draw. I mean, there's paintings. There are paintings of the scenery made too for just the color. But the actual detail, they would use panoramic cameras to capture a lot of the detail, and then they would use the painting as the sort of like a guide for the color, and then we use the photograph for the detail. And then they combine them, and they will paint the backdrops.
All right. So James L. Clark does a pencil drawing.
At that point, he was just a manager. He would just foresee everybody else's work. He was just like running around, making sure everything is happening at the same time. And he would approve the final, he will sign off the diorama and seal it.
I see.
That's it, another one made.
So you look at a hyena or...
These are earlier drawings. Some of these are actually go back to 1906, 1910, when he was a young boy or young man painting or drawing in like Brooklyn Zoo, or at the, actually Brooklyn didn't have a zoo, it's Bronx Zoo.
Bronx Zoo.
Or like the Central Park Zoo. So he began by just being interested and going down there and making drawings. And then these drawings, he brought them to the museum and incorporated into this archive. The point I'm trying to make about the exhibition is that these displays, because of the complexity, they were impossible to make without a comprehensive image archives. And Clark kind of recognized that, and he was very much involved with the creation of the museum's image archive, which works sort of like a Google Images for the museum.
Okay, so before his time, for sure.
Yes, he kind of knew that like in order to like be able to like understand things, you need to have multiple images from multiple sources all put together. So when you're thinking of something, you go there and you grab these cards that will have like multiple images of, could be an animal, could be a plant, could be a bird, but it could also be a phenomenon like say earthquake or other kind of topics that deal with nature. So the Clark files provided visual resource for dioramas, but they also provided visual resource for all sorts of topics that the museum was dealing with.
So it's a good thing the museum didn't throw them out.
Yes, they, you know what happened was like they had kind of like lost a little bit of connection to them because of the staff retiring and not knowing. But then there were people in the museum who claimed that like parts of the Clark files were used all the way until Google Images were launched in the late 90s.
Really?
Yeah, because it's so easy to sort of like, you're thinking of something, it's so easy to just go to a drawer, pull it, and grab all these cards, and all the pictures of it are there. I mean, it's so hard for us to remember. It's so hard now to remember life without Google Images.
Yes.
But there was a time when there were no Google Images.
I lived in that time.
And you know, I was
You may not have been born.
No, I remember too.
Okay, good.
I was telling one of my students that these dioramas were made when there were no calculators, and he said, "Calculators? You mean they didn't have calculators?" So it's hard to remember, even like not having calculators.
No internet,
all the measurements,
no digital.
All the measurements had to be made with like paper and thinking. You know, like architects, everyone working on these dioramas, they didn't have
no
any
high-tech
machinery.
gadgets, none of that. So when you look at the monkeys, and I'm assuming they are life-size monkeys.
Everything is life-size.
In the taxidermy done by Clark or someone else?
Taxidermy done by Clark or under his supervision. But he would have in taxidermy, he would more be hands-on with taxidermy.
So when you walked in there, the emotion, what did it feel like? Now that you who live in the modern age.
Well, there's this feeling of like temporal connection. You have this time you feel like has been compressed. The time, both is the time of the moment where these animals were hunted, or like when it was happening in Africa, the collection was happening, and then all the time in between, which is like from the opening of the hall to this moment. So you kind of feel like all of this time period has been kind of like squeezed into this one display. So you have this like, and that's why they're so captivating and still one of the most popular museum displays. And
so many of the museums and galleries in New York are free. You can walk in free.
Yes, you can walk in with a small donation of 1 penny.
Exactly. Nature, Knowledge, and the Knower until January 14th at the Satellite Gallery up on Seymour Street.
Yes.
How great. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you. Mohammad Salemy.